Just staying in the era of Arthur for the moment, then.
Yes.
Your previous book, The Holy Kingdom, went into that with a great deal of detail. But you think there's some adjustments that you would make to that now?
Yes, there are. Without going into details, within the hypothesis of Wilson and Blackett, Arthur the First figure, they believe was a 6th century ancestor of Arthur the Second, and that he lived at the time just after the Romans.
4th century ancestor, is it?
He's a 5th century ancestor.
Oh, right, okay. So yeah. I thought you said 6th.
Yeah. The second one is,
right.
But this one is 6th generations earlier.
Right.
And they believe that his centre of his kingdom, I have to get this right, was in the West Midlands, a place called Atherstone.
Mm-hmm.
So they believe that that's where Glastonbury was, and that's all connected with that Arthur I. I now tend to the other idea, which is that Arthur I was indeed, like many of the histories say, descended from the kings of Brittany. And there was that connection there with Constantine, his brother, and Uther Pendragon. So I go along with that more traditional, you could say, view, and that he came from there and he fought his battles, and partly in the southwest, but more up in Scotland, I think, on the edge there. So that's where we differ slightly. But on Arthur II, I'm right with them.
Right.
That he was a Welsh guy from Glamorgan, and his tomb is here in Glamorgan.
Right. You mentioned earlier the Romans coming to Britain.
Yes.
So around that time, this is when Christianity reaches Britain.
Yes.
And you've found new evidence
yes.
with regards to that in your book, The Blood of Avalon.
I have indeed. I mean, this was astounding. The story goes that after the Romans invaded Britain, they had a quite easy time getting the southeast, but ran into more trouble as they went west and north, partly because it's more mountainous, partly because the tribes there were, more militaristic and fought back harder. And there was a guy called Caractacus, it was called Caradoc in Welsh, the Romans called him Caractacus, and he fought a long campaign for 9 years against the Romans, a sort of guerrilla campaign, from 43 AD. So that takes us up to 52 AD?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. And eventually he was betrayed, and the Romans captured him and his whole family, and they took them back to Rome. And you'd expect that to be curtains. It normally was. If they capture someone like that, they parade them through the street and then they strangle them and throw the body in the Tiber. I mean, that was the Roman way. But Caradoc, I suppose he must have spoken either Latin or Greek, but he made an impassioned speech in the Senate. Claudius was there with his wife, and the Senate gathered round. And he said to Claudius, look, I'm a king of kings, I've got many people, under me. And you expected me to just surrender, just like that. And he said, yeah, you won, but, you can kill me, and it'll soon be forgotten. But you have mercy, and pardon me, and it'll be remembered forever. And Claudius kind of liked, I'm not inventing this, you can read this in the works of the Roman historian Tacitus. He actually records the whole speech. And Claudius quite liked that, he obviously quite liked Caradoc.
Right.
And so he did pardon him. He made the proviso he had to stay in Rome, and he was never to bear arms against Rome again. Right. So they settled in a place called Esquiline Hill in Rome. And very interestingly, his whole family were there, and one of his daughters married a Roman senator called Rufus Pudens, who had been stationed in Britain. So there's a kind of karmic love match or something happening there. He became a Christian, right? And their house later became the Church of St. Pudentiana, which is on the Esquiline Hill. And that is actually the original Cathedral of Rome. And a cathedral means that's where the bishop has his seat.
Mm-hmm.
This little church, you can go there, and this is the original Cathedral of Rome. Later it was transferred to the big Basilica of St. John's Lateran, but they took the altar, which was a wooden altar, from the Church of St. Prudenziana to St. John's Lateran. And tradition has it that Prudence, what was her name? Claudia, his wife Claudia, they had a son called Timothy and another son called Linus.
Mm-hmm.
You can read names, Rufus and Claudia, Prudence and Claudia and Timothy in St. Paul's letters. He says, send my regards,
Right.
to Claudia and this kind of thing.
Right.
He stayed with them when he was in Rome,
Right.
And when the early Christian martyrs were being killed in time of Nero, St. Prudenziana, who was the daughter of Claudia, and her sister Praxedes buried the bodies. Right? They
Right.
went out, gathered the bodies and buried them. Now, where did they bury them? Interestingly, there was another church there called St. Praxedes, or Praxide in Italian. If you ever go to Rome, you must go there because it has these wonderful frescoes on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
They're like sort of Byzantine mosaics. And go in there, and underneath there are catacombs.
Right.
And there was a notice there. I went in there with an Italian friend. He'd never been there before. He didn't know anything about this place. And he was amazed. There was a thing in Italian all about it. And it said that there were 13 popes buried there, and I think 3,000 Christian martyrs
Right.
in these vaults underneath the church. And nobody knows about this place.
Right.
But what was telling, they had just around from the main door, the entranceway, was a little area, not a chapel, it was more like a little museum. And there were scraps and pieces of what have obviously been an earlier building, or maybe more than one. And among these scraps, stuck on the wall, for you to see, were green man masks.
Right.
Now, the green man is nothing to do with Rome, right?
Oh, right.
This goes back to the early Celtic,
Right.
pre-Christian religion of Britain,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the other Druidic areas of Gaul and Belgium. You won't find all that in southern Europe. So who the hell was doing green man masks? It can only be Caractacus and his family before they became Christian.
Right. I see.
Yeah? So that to me was proof positive that there was truth in this story.
All right. And with regards Jesus himself, there are writers who will say that he was a fictional character.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, I'm quite certain he was a real person.
Right.
I'm a Christian. And people say, well, the Gospels are written sort of 80 years after his death. But St. Paul's epistles weren't. And the other epistles, they were written not long after he died. So they are very early texts that tell us that, a lot about this new religion that was growing.
And it was being spread by Joseph of Arimathea, you think? Can you tell us about him? Because you believe he did come to
Absolutely.
Britain.
Yeah.
But you're far more sceptical over some people say that Jesus came to Britain. You
Well, I've not seen any evidence for that,
yeah.
and I'm someone that likes evidence.
But you do think there's evidence of Joseph of Arimathea in Britain?
Well, it's certainly in our histories.
Right. So do you want to?
Yes, I will.
So this is a relative of Jesus, then?
Yes. The tradition is that he was Jesus' uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Either his uncle or his great uncle. There's a little bit of unclarity there. He was either Mary's brother or he was her uncle. Mm-hmm. And he's the rich man who supposedly provided the room for the Last Supper. And after the crucifixion, he's the man who had the job of taking the body down from the cross. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the sort of Jewish high-ups, the council. Because he was in that position, he could ask for the body You know, normally they're not going to do that, but he was able to ask for the body. And supposedly he's the one that pulled the nails out and got the body down and then had it put in his own tomb. You read all about that in the Bible.
Right.
Well, the legend goes that he later came to Britain with his own disciples, that he was a secret disciple of Jesus. As we know the 12 apostles by name, you know, but this guy's a very senior member of the Jewish hierarchy. He can't be seen openly to be following this other guy.
And he's known as Saint Illyd.
In Welsh,
In
yeah.
Welsh.
The Welsh tradition is that after Caractacus went to Rome, his whole family, his father was a guy called Bran, which means crow in Welsh. Bran the Blessed. And Caractacus had children, and among these children was a woman called Urgine, or which we would pronounce Eugenie. It's the same name as Igerna in the Arthurian legends. It's a name that was obviously popular. Urgine. And Saint Urgine came back with Joseph of Arimathea, and according to the Welsh traditions, he lived at a place called Clan Illyd, where there's a big round earthwork. Have you ever been there?
Is this is that the
giant
modern
circle? Yeah.
Is that the modern place name, Clan Illyd?
Clan Illyd, yeah. There's a church there, and there's an earthwork which is a big round, like Avebury, a big round circle.
Right.
It's got trees growing in it.
I don't think I've been there.
Oh, well, you must go there.
I've been to St Illtyd's church, which is much
that's
later.
Different. That's
Right,
different. And see, the idea is that the British, the Druidic people, their tradition was that if you were going to have a sacred event, you were going to do anything that was religious, you had to do it during daylight hours in the open, so the sun can see what you're doing. The sun's the eye of God, and it's watching what you do. So I could talk for hours about that. But anyway, this Earth Circle is obviously where he did his first sermons,
right,
to convert the British.
And
can I just finish?
Yeah, sure.
And St. Urgine supposedly founded the first college, Christian college, which was at Llaniltyd, where Llaniltyd's church is, Llanwit Major. That is the site of the first college. They call it the Cor Urgine, which means the choir of Urgine, and there were little monk cells around it, and that's where they would study.
Right. This is at Llanwit Major.
Llanwit Major, yeah.
Right. So you would say that's one of the first places that was preaching Christianity in Britain?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Can I just say add another little rider to that? I mentioned King Edgar and how he was found in Glastonbury. He came with a raiding party and deliberately sacked Llanwit Major and stole a bell from there.
Right.
And the legend goes he took it away, and the horses were really upset by what he was doing, and he was having terrible dreams, so he ended up returning it. It's a famous story about the bell.
Right.
Something you could look into.
Yes. All right. Well, if we just consider again the area where Wilson and Blackett did their excavation for the stone and the silver cross. I've covered that on the programme before, which are the relics of the legendary King Arthur.
Yeah.
And you believe that that's all good evidence and it's true. Now, that particular area and west of that area, am I right in thinking that in your new book you're saying that the Normans, that was an area that they didn't get full control over?
Yeah, right,
when they had the Norman conquest, that this was part of Wales which remained for some reason outside of the control.
Yes.
So just tell us about that. So so we've got Wales being taken over by the Normans. We've got this special place which you've termed as Avalon.
Yeah.
And do you think this is the real Glastonbury as well?
Yes.
Is in there? So just give us some of that.
Just give you the outline of that. Well, the Normans came in 1092. Right, and they seized the Vale of Glamorgan. This is Holy Castle, and it has a very important part to play in the history that we're discussing about the blood of Avalon. The story goes that when the Normans invaded the Vale of Glamorgan, around about 1092, they seized the castles of Glamorgan and the manor houses, but not this one. And Sir Robert Fitzhamon, the Earl of Gloucester, divided up the spoils among his trusted knights, called the 12 Knights of Despoilation. But he left out one knight. He had an argument with him, a guy called Sir Payne de Turberville. And the story goes that he told Sir Payne, "You go and find your own," that he wasn't going to give him anything. So Sir Payne came with a little retinue of knights and laid siege to Coity. Now, it wouldn't have been this castle here that we see now. This is a later building, Norman and after. But there would have been something here. And the guy who owned it and owned the lordship that went with it was called Morgan, and he was a descendant of the kings of Glamorgan, a grandson or great-grandson of Iestyn ap Gurgen, the last of the kings. And Morgan came out with his sword in one hand and his daughter in the other, and he said, "Let's not have blood spilt this day. Either you fight me man to man for my castle, or you marry my daughter." And Sir Payne wasn't stupid. He married the daughter, and by that way he got this lordship, got himself some land through marriage, not conquest. And he didn't owe it to his overlord, Sir Robert Fitzhamon. And he married the daughter, and then in the Turberville lineage there were twice more that they married into the royal line of Glamorgan. So they were in the lineage, as it were, through marriage. And this place here remained free from taxes. He didn't have to pay taxes to his overlord or the King of England or anyone else. They remained free. And this place remained free of taxes and a special place right up until 1405. So there's another side to this story as well, which hasn't really been understood properly, I think. Because Sir Payne de Turberville, he was a Breton. And there's another famous Breton in the Arthurian legends, who's Lancelot du Lac. And Lancelot comes to the Grail Castle, and he's served up food by the owners of the castle and asked a question, "Who does the Grail serve?" And he doesn't know the answer, and he disappears. It's all part of the story. But he sleeps with the daughter of the castle's owner, the Grail Guardian's daughter, Elaine, who disguises herself to look like Guinevere. And afterwards, Lancelot is disgusted with himself. "Oh, what have I done? What have I done? You know, I love Guinevere." But Elaine becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to the perfect knight, Galahad, who later on becomes the new Grail Guardian, and he's the perfect knight. And this, I believe, is the real Grail Castle, and the story they're talking about is a veiled reference to the lineage of the Turbervilles, who became the lords of Coity through marriage, and their line that descends from them. They are the true Grail Guardians, and goes up right up to the present.
Right.
So the lordship of Coity, which included that little chapel on the hill in its property, and I think it also included Clan Illid. I'm not sure. Just near Clan Illid, 3 miles from there, is Trevran, which means the farmstead or manor of Bran. So Bran the Blessed would be living there. St. Illid, who's his kind of confessor, his mentor, is living just nearby.
Right.
So, and then you've got this church of Arthur on the hill. Well, the name of that church on the hill, and this is something I also researched, it's called Clan Bedivere in Welsh. My accent is probably really appalling, but that's kind of what it's called, which means the church of Peter on the hill, on the mountain, right? Bedr, spelt with a B, because it's got clan in front of it. But that's kind of like Welsh, they're always changing the first letter of things when they join words together. It would be Peder if it was just on its own, Peter. But Bedr is also an alternative spelling to that. It could be Bedr, B-E-W-R, right? Which is the Welsh for Bedivere. So Sir Bedivere in our romances, who's Arthur's closest knight, the one who buries him,
Right.
yeah, would be Sir Peter. So St. Peter on the hill, he's burying Arthur on there. He builds himself a little hermitage. Now, when they did the dig there, one of the things they found was a round hermitage building dating from that era.
Mm-hmm.
And right in the middle of that, they found this votive cross, Pro Anima Artorius, written on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be where Bedivere lived.
Yeah.
So Bedivere. And when you read the Grail legends, yeah, and the Mort d'Arthur in particular, you'll find a chapter in there where it talks about Sir Bedivere, how remorseful he was about the death of Arthur, and he gave up his being a knight and became a hermit, and he lived there by Arthur's grave, yeah, for the rest of his days, you know.
Right. So this is fitting in with the traditional mythical King Arthur.
Absolutely.
In Wales, but not in
Glastonbury.
Right.
So that's, you know, so when you go to Coity, yeah, Coity Castle, I believe that is what in legend is called the Grail Castle, because just flowing from there is a little stream. It's called the Nant Bryn Glas. Yeah.
Mm.
Bryn Glas means green or bluey-green hill, right?
Right.
Now, hill, when you put that into English, can be ton.
Right.
So Glas ton.
Okay.
Yeah? So it's the Bryn Glas ton. When a river flows into another river in Welsh, they call the confluence Aber. Aber, and it's always named after the smaller tributary that's coming in. So it'd be the Aber Bryn Glas. Yeah.
Mm.
Aber Glaston.
Right.
Right.
So the name of Glastonbury's coming out there.
Yeah. And the church that's nearest to there, just a mile or two up the road from there, is called Coy Church. And that's the old church before they built the church at Coity.
Right.
It's the original church is there. And there's old stones and things there. And another name for that church is Clan Grallow. And if you read up in established history, they say, well, there was a St. Crallo, and they make up a whole legend about it, St. Crallo. But you won't find him in any genealogies.
Right. So
It's the Church of the Grail.
Right.
Behind me here is Coy Church, which is the original church of the Lordship of Coity. Later on, they built the Church of St. Mary's, which you can see right next to the castle. But this is the original church, and it's pre-Norman. Foundations, anyway. Goes back, we don't know how far back. But it has another name besides Coy Church, which is Clan Grallow in Welsh. And we're told that that means the Church of St. Crallo. Now, I don't believe this. There's nowhere mentioned St. Crallo in the genealogies of the saints. And each church has its own saint, and the genealogies are all very clear as to who's who and who's related to whom. There's no St. Crallo. It's an invention. And the mythology about him is very contrived. I believe that St. Crallo, or Clan Grallow, means Church of the Grail. Pure and simple. This area here is the real Avalon, the real Avalac, and this is where the Grail was kept, in this area, and this is the church. So it makes sense to me, and it fits together with the history. Well, this stream might not look very much, but it's actually very important. It's called in Welsh the Nant Bryn Glas. And Nant means a stream or brook. And Bryn Glas, it gets that name from, there's a grassy or green hill over there. And that's quite a common name in Welsh for grassy hills, Bryn Glas. Bryn means hill, Glas means green or bluey. Now, you've probably heard the name Glastonbury described as another name for the Avalon. And it supposedly is in Somerset. But the other name for Glastonbury is Aberglaston. Now, an Aber in Welsh means the confluence of two rivers, or an estuary where it comes into the sea. And here we have the Nant Bringlass flowing down, and it joins with the Iweni River just a little further along, which that joining point would be called Aberbringlas. Now, Bryn means hill, and so does Ton in Glaston. So Aberglaston means the same as Aberbringlas. So this is the real Glastonbury, is in this area.
I'll just get a shot of the Iweni River, so it just disappears through these little tunnels here.
Yeah.
And if I come up, so that's flowing into the Iweni River. Now, the fact that this area has remained outside the jurisdiction, let's say, of the Normans, is that just, and also contains these Arthurian relics?
Yes.
Is that just a coincidence, or was that done deliberately to protect those relics then? Or?
Well, I think it's both. The whole thing with Sir Payne de Turberville, he kind of went native, you could say. He was actually a Breton rather than a Norman. So the Breton language is very similar to Welsh, so he could have talked to the Welsh. He married a Welsh woman. And two others of his descendants, the Turbervilles, married Welsh princesses. Oh. Yeah, so they became Welsh, and because they were outside of Norman jurisdiction, they didn't have to pay taxes. But because of their Norman ancestry, the Normans weren't going to destroy them. Oh. Yeah, so it actually remained outside of the control of the crown. Initially, the robber barons and like Sir Robert Fitzhammond and the Clares and people like that were outside of the jurisdiction of the King of England because Wales wasn't England. But once, of course, the invasion of Wales had fully taken place, things were kind of brought under the English crown. But this place didn't become subject to the crown until 1405. And that was because it was sieged by Owen Glendower, the Welsh patriot, who burnt down all the other castles in Wales, but not that one.
So you think Owen Glendower may have known there was something important about
he knew there was something important.
Right.
And his siege was raised by Prince Harry, later Henry V, who came with an army and saved Coity. And because of that, they then had to start paying taxes.
All right, well, let's just consider the Holy Grail then, Adrian.
Yeah.
Because obviously there are lots of books about the Holy Grail and what it is or isn't.
Yeah.
So you think this castle has a connection to the Holy Grail?
It has a connection to the whole Grail legend, yeah.
Holy Grail legend. So what is the Holy Grail, in your opinion?
That's a whole other story.
But it's linked to this castle in some way.
Very much.
A bloodline.
Yes. There is a bloodline of Grail keepers, right? This is what you read in the texts. And they were obviously doing something similar to the Mass, the Mass, holding the chalice up, this is my blood and all that.
Right.
But what they obviously had in their possession was, I think, the original punch bowl, if you like, of Joseph of Arimathea. Because when in Roman times, they used to mix the wine with water. Right? They'd have a big bowl called a crater. Right? They'd pour the wine in and water in, and then they'd drink out of that. And description in the Last Supper. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man. Very likely he had a crater made of silver. Yeah, he would have had a crater. And if he's leaving Jerusalem and taking the rest of his family with him, and they're coming to Britain, he's not going to leave that behind.
Right.
So this idea about collecting the blood of Christ in the crater is all to do with understanding the mysticism behind very early Christianity.
Right.
And I could give you whole lectures on that, but we're going beyond the subject there. But basically the whole thing about the Holy Grail is not the Grail itself, it's the Holy Ghost that comes down and feeds everyone with the food that most delights them.
Right.
And it happens on Whit Sunday, if you remember, in the Arthurian legends, which is the Feast of the Holy Ghost. So this is what that's all about. It's the inner mystery of Christianity, and the presence of the love energy that comes in with it.
Let me just throw you an off-field question. Bringing Christianity didn't prevent any more killing than went before it, did it? Really? It didn't stop people cutting people's heads off,
well, it hasn't stopped people. I mean, it's
now when
it's
the
opened
country
a
was
path.
right, but when there was paganism or the Druid religion, would there not have been a lot more peace in the country
they did
then?
blood sacrifice.
Yeah, but that was in a controlled way for.
Well, we don't know, do we?
Yeah. Do you know? Because I did an interview recently with a chap who's following this ideology coming out of Russia based on Vedic traditions, where everyone has a plot of land and they live in peace and harmony.
Very nice too.
Which was kind of replaced by Christianity.
Right.
This is why I'm just throwing that question in.
Yeah.
That it.
Well,
in your book there is surprisingly a lot of people getting their heads chopped off.
Well, there are. I mean,
Well, maybe not surprisingly.
there are
but that's-
bad guys.
Yeah.
There are bad guys around. But the real message of Christianity, if you read the story of Jesus, he's not cutting anyone's head off.
No.
In fact, he's putting the ear back on the servant of the high priest, isn't he?
That's true. That's true.
Title.
So you think Joseph of Arimathea was living in Glamorgan, or Coity, and also maybe Cardiff or is it South Wales?
Primarily, I mean, he maybe travelled around to other places too.
Right.
But, I mean, he was an old man at the time. But the original Christianity as it was developed, you had Jesus with his 12 disciples, right? Then he sends them off. And they have to duplicate what he had done. So each one of them would have had disciples. Right? So you have St. Thomas, who supposedly went east. You had St. Philip, who went to France. Other ones went to other places.
Right.
And Joseph of Arimathea supposedly was sent by Philip to Britain and brought with him 12 disciples.
Right.
So what he would have been doing is establishing a church. Now, a church, the word church, comes from the Greek word kirkos, or Latin circus. It should be pronounced churchus,
Right.
church, and it means a circle. So it's not a building, right? It's an organisation of a circle where you have the teacher in the middle and the disciples round the edge.
Right.
Yeah?
I see.
Like Jesus was with his.
Right.
So they're duplicating that. And the idea carried on in Wales right up into Arthurian times and beyond, that you had a saintly man who's kind of the wise one, and he takes on disciples as his circle. And he founds a church, like St. Illtyd you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there were other famous ones, who St. Samson. And
Right. So he's alleged to be Arthur's cousin. Is that right?
Yes.
So his church was not far from Landwick Major, which I've been to.
Yeah.
So we were talking about Wilson and Blackett.
Yeah.
And so they are putting forward this King Arthur in South Wales
Yes.
theory or
Yeah.
actual evidence.
Yeah.
So why do you think then? Why is that so dangerous?
Well, I mean, it's dangerous on many different levels. First of all, you have to understand that the Welsh call them classe churches, right, which were schools. So basically their idea of religion wasn't that you had a big hierarchy with a pope on top and bishops and what have you. It was you had a holy man who was teaching the people to become spiritual and to develop. Well, that's a bit like you've got your own little burger stand, right? You're doing nice business in Coity or wherever, and then suddenly McDonald's moves in and opens a branch, closes you down, opens a branch. This is what the Normans did.
Right.
They closed down all these classe churches, gave them to the big orders, the Benedictines and the rest of them. And they then set up abbeys and priories and what have you, which are tied into the hierarchy to teach standard level what's being dictated down from above.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a completely different kind of version of Christianity.
Right.
Now, I think that resurrecting this Arthurian connection with that church on the hill is uncomfortable for those who don't want that to be known about. And among those people we could include the church hierarchy, And who's at the top of the church hierarchy? The Church of England?
Right, the Queen, yeah.
Queen.
Yeah, right. So this was the churches in Coity then remained separate, remained like, not like the McDonald's, the small burger places. They're still practicing Christianity
ones of them
in a different way.
Yeah.
Not centrally controlled.
It wasn't totally free in Coity, because remember the Normans were around and they're building new churches and so on. But something remained there. And there was, I think, an undercurrent that was connecting back to all this. And the whole Arthurian thing is very worrying to the Norman establishment. They have to try to control it,
right?
Because it's tied in with patriotism and the risk of rebellion.
Right. At some point, though, Coity was taken over by the Normans. Is that right?
Well, it was sort of at the time of Payne de Turberville, but what happened was he became Welshified, right, and his family. But then they died out in their name, and it went over briefly to a family called Berkerolles, Sir Lawrence Berkerolles, who was the son of a couple of one of the last princesses or ladies of the Turberville dynasty. But then he was murdered by his wife, and there was a big upset and trial, and she was buried at the crossroads outside St. Athens, and her ghost is still said to haunt the place. And then there was debate about whether it should then go to his relatives who were nothing to do with the Turberville line, or it should revert back upstream, if you like, and go to another line of the Turbervilles and then down from there. And that's what happened. It went to the family called Gamage. And the Gamages ruled it for a couple of 100 years, a bit longer, till the last one. Eventually they died out in the male line. There was one, a lady called Barbara Gamage, who was the heiress that was left. And in 1584, so we're in time of Queen Elizabeth I now, she married a young man called Robert Sidney. And he was the younger brother of Sir Philip Sidney, who was very famous as the poet. He was the great chivalric knight.
Right.
And Robert married this lady, Barbara, without the Queen's permission. The Queen had other ideas for who she should marry. So he was in bad light with her, and it caused problems later. But anyway, she married him. His brother died 2 years later. And so he then became the eldest son of the Sidneys. And in due course, under James I, he inherited the titles of his uncle, the Earl of Leicester. Remember, the Earl of Leicester, the Queen Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley. So he was a nephew of Robert Dudley, and he inherited his titles, Earl of Leicester, Viscount de Lisle. And they are very important in sort of later, that sort of Jacobean period, and have a connection to what's called the Rosicrucian movement.
Right.
And I've researched that in some detail. It involves James I's daughter and Frederick V of the Palatine in Germany. They ruled a little state called the Palatinate, had its capital at Heidelberg. And they were championing the idea of science, of new ideas, finding new knowledge, and really, really upset the Catholic Church. And especially when he was elected, or he became king of Bohemia, and he could have been, there was a risk that he was going to be elected as the next emperor. So they came down really hard on him and drove him out of Bohemia, Prague first, and then they destroyed Heidelberg and started the 30 Years' War, which was a terrible catastrophe for Europe. But that was all sort of, wasn't meant to happen. But the Rosicrucian movement later developed into what we would call the science movement, particularly something called the Invisible College in Britain, which I think we might be talking about in another time.
Is any of this covered in your other book, London and New Jerusalem?
It is.
So can you give us a brief summary of that book, Adrian? What does it explore?
That explores principally, the way that London was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666 to be a new Jerusalem in preparation for the return of the Messiah.
Right.
Because there was a belief, still is in some quarters, that the British are descended from the lost tribes of Israel,
Yeah.
so that Britain is the new Israel.